So for example, it's like literally, it doesn't mean don't, it just means don't sit.
We're going to be doing the course evaluation thing the old-fashioned way when you leave the room.
For people
Well, I think
I've already given this to some.
write this down. My belief is that he's already in the law. Okay. But he's like about the discussion, right? So he still manages to
I just mentioning to Michael that I have a problem which requires me to leave at 2:10. An unavoidable commitment. Michael will continue until the very end. No, I've given it to someone, but there are very few students here. So I don't need to.
maybe not understanding as well. So this is distributed. Like some of it is considered that we didn't. That not everything that is. There are certain things. Yeah. There are certain things. Like. Yeah. I don't know about Western Union, but. Those who are supporting don't necessarily said, particularly with respect to him, because they say that's inconsistent with what they believe existed was. It's like a super deep field. There's like a whole society in London. Wait.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So this is actually our final session. There is, needless to say, a huge amount to discuss. And as we mentioned last week, our recommendation for doing so is to open this up. So we would like you to begin. Comments, thoughts, suggestions, interventions. One obvious thing you're more than welcome to do is discuss things you've been thinking about for your final project, but it need not be. It may be something radically different that interests you precisely because you're not writing on it, that you want to bring it up in class. Anything that will be of interest. And then our goal during this session will be to be intermediaries with all of you as we discuss the huge issues from this course.
So needless to say in that regard, you should feel free to respond to one another.
Oh, absolutely.
As well.
So this doesn't have to be questions to us, indeed. Feel free to make arguments. Others respond to those arguments, absolutely. So we will simply be a part of this conversation. Mm-hmm. So let us open it up. Please.
Just one comment that all the philosophers that we had to study seem to focus on the individual. And it seems that the solution to the statement that was presented at the beginning of the course has to do with the individual. All I want to do is to emphasize that the individual needs the group. It's a back and forth, always. You cannot isolate the individual and say, oh, you'll grow up and you'll mature if you read this and this and study and have this. But you need the group. The group is what advances the cause. Then you have a whole bunch of individuals of like mind who get together in a unified way to advance whatever cause you wish to advance. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you. An argument on the table. Response, agreement, disagreement. Please.
We talked about it a little bit when, particularly when Professor Unger would talk about the political aspect of certain philosophies, so the political aspect of self-construction. I think we talked about how self-construction translates into work and then in the system of labor. So that, at least to me, that was one side of the the course that took a more communal look at it.
So we did remark in an earlier class that one way of dividing the views that we've discussed in the class is the distinction between those views that define the project as social from the beginning, that is having to do with our engagement with one another, and those that do not. So I understand your comment now in part as an objection to that second category views. Yes.
Well, I tend to see that comment more along the lines that what we are asking for is a little taste of a positive program that would involve social, political,
Yes.
economic dimensions too. You have given us a brief outline. I remember when we talked about Kierkegaard.
But just a moment.
Yes.
But you would agree that, for example, the Emersonian idea of self-construction,
I still don't
or
know
the
what that is.
romantic ideal of self-transformation is a positive project. It's not a project that we might embrace or approve, but it is a positive project.
It is a positive project, but in my mind, or the way I see your project and your attention to the level of detail required for anything like an account of the self to be worthy talking about, would have to be filled in much greater detail than this triumphalist proclamation that to be yourself, you must be yourself, listen to yourself, and only to yourself, and nobody else other than yourself.
But if your words were words about Emerson or other thinkers in that line, like Nietzsche, they may be unfair because they actually give a great deal of texture of what it would mean to live in that way. Once again, it may not be a project that we agree with, but it doesn't seem right to object to their view that it fails for its lack of detail. There's plenty of detail.
But somehow I feel that that account, and perhaps this would be also Hegel's critique of it, if we were to approach it from the skeptical side, would tend to emphasize very selective aspects of a bigger whole that needs to be described with more care and whose individual aspects must be shown as connected and logically following from one another and perhaps embraced with one another in some tension. I don't see that happening in Nietzsche that much, or in Emerson, because oftentimes when some big transcendental signifier is dropped, I feel like asking a very simple Platonic question, well, what is X? And press for a definition and to see an elaborate dialogical investigation, which...
But it seems that two different kinds of complaints are being combined here. So one complaint is the complaint about inadequate detail and embodiment in a textured project. The other complaint is a complaint about the rejection of systematic argument in the style of philosophers like Aristotle and Hegel. Those are two different complaints. They may have some relation to each other, but philosophers like Aristotle and Nietzsche very self-consciously rejected that style of argument. It's not that they somehow failed to live up to that standard. They rejected that standard. That's not the kind of philosophizing that they believed in. But that's a different argument about how we should philosophize.
Well, but is it not, are the two not connected?
Loosely, because I don't think that it follows from the rejection of the systematizing style of argument that a proposal may fail in detail. There's a huge amount of detail in Nietzsche and in Emerson, but it's not in the form of philosophizing that systematic philosophers like Aristotle or Hegel adopted.
Sure, but then I, coming from a more concrete philosophical side, would probably then have difficulty understanding what is it that Nietzsche is trying to tell me, other than a few beautiful metaphors on which he builds his project. And they're powerful metaphors as they are, that every one of us needs to experience life with the visceral intensity of a pagan god or a great ancient hero. But if that's fundamentally all there is to his argument, or all that I can truly discern, then it is difficult for me to see what kind of society he can be proposing for us to build, and what kind of institutional life or what kind of institutions it would have, and what would we do, what would we do with the everyday into which we are so well immersed. And I know that you have so much more to say on this in coming from exactly different angles of approaching exactly this thing. So for an account of the self, however synthetic or eclectic it might be in the end of this course, you have a very concrete and very detailed edifice that could live to the reputation of a sociality of reason.
I won't belabor the point, but it seems to me important to have an open and magnanimous view of the forms that exemplary conceptions of how to live can take. So to go even further away from systematic thinking, you might say that the 19th and 20th century European novels present implicitly images of life and of how not to live, but certainly not in the form of a systematic discourse. And some would say all the more powerful for rejecting the form of systematic discourse. And certainly in this course here, for better or for worse, our overwhelming emphasis has been on content rather than on method. You want to add something to that, Michael?
Not yet. I will add later. Yep.
Just picking up from that last point, I agree with that, and I think that's interesting. I think that, in fact, literature can offer a lot of value in terms of deliberating about the moral life. And I wonder if you might say a few words, if you're familiar with the work of Martha Nussbaum, who was in the law school and philosophy department at Chicago, and she talks about the notion of feelings or emotions behind the law. And as I understand it, in one of her books, she talked about also the question of genre, and how, at least on her reading, that the Platonic dialogues were not necessarily meant to be systematized philosophy, but rather sort of instructional dialogues to teach people about perhaps how to be moral, but not as systematized as Aristotle. And just thinking about it in the context of this course, which is concerned with the content. Yeah, I mean, I just think it's partially comment, partially question, which is to say that I feel that even in the rationalized forms of philosophy, it doesn't always account for the experiential world, that we're beings who have senses and feelings and emotions, and that, as our colleague said here, right, we're in a culture, we're acculturated, and that from this we learn how to act, and maybe learn how not to act, and that's how we go about in the world. So I mean, yeah, I think I would agree with you, and that culture or society and being social beings and not purely individuals, but informed by others is a major part of how to act.
It seems to me that there's in relation to these remarks now, there's a problem that, to my mind, is revealed in the attempt to do what we have done here. So we present a series of first-order projects for the conduct of life. These post-Christian, post-ancient philosophy projects, like the 5 projects in the lower part of the chart that I drew on the board last week. And it seems that our fundamental reaction, or the most common reaction, is to resist subscribing fully to any of those projects. So it's as if the mere attempt to expound them suggested their partiality. That may be the most common response. So I wonder how many people here would have been inclined to choose one of those 5 projects, at least as a point of departure for the development of their own conception of how to live. I think that we resist. We resist that, but then where are we when we resist? So the ordinary opinion of humanity is confused and eclectic, and as if we were to say to ourselves that each of these views has a little bit of truth. Well, is there some higher order view that then tells us which part of truth? That is, what is the part of truth and what is the part of error in each of these conceptions? Or instead of such a higher order view, are we then just thrown back on our habitual confusion? This is a very fundamental problem because it's at once methodological or epistemological and psychological and moral. And I wonder what you think about it in relation to your own experience here in the course of the semester in engaging with these ideas. Do you see what I'm trying to ask? Is it, or is it too obscure? So when it's the clearer it is, the more formulaic and almost childlike or childish it may seem to be. And then one might ask oneself, how could a serious person who has read the novels of the 19th or 20th century and who has had some experience of the world simply embrace one of those views? But what does it mean not to embrace them? Now, if what it means is then to resort to a higher order view that guides us in selecting among those views, then it seems that we've doubled the bet and we're claiming to have a degree of higher philosophical insight that we really don't have. But if that's not what we're intending to do, what are we intending to do? Is it some kind of ad hoc reaction to the selective insights of these different conceptions? So, where are we? Are we in the same confusion that we were in before? That's what I'm trying to understand. Yes.
Well, I'm thinking, in your work on the religion of the future, you talk about like the tasks that are before us now, and in reading that, I sort of saw the very philosophies that we studied being, like you said, taken parts of and put together, like the first of the self-construction of how do we bring together transcendence and solidarity, and then the idea of how do we live in the future while, how do we look towards the future while living in the now, and then the part about stopping ourselves from trying to be God and instead try to be more God-like. And maybe I'd like to direct your question back to you in terms of your own work. It seems to me, and I may have taken it completely wrong, but it seems to me that in your own work, you have taken bits and pieces of all these philosophies and put them together to look towards a religion of the future. Or did I completely misread?
Well, maybe that's what I've done, but it's not what I thought I was doing. So I do argue in this philosophical program for a conception of the conduct of life, and the cast of my mind is the cast that you refer to. In relation to philosophers like Aristotle and Hegel, it is to try to understand everything and to bring the ideas in relation to one another. In the hope that we would find a way to do that would not simply be the repetition of the illusory and pretentious classical idea of philosophy, that it is a super science in the service of self-help and an attempt to console us for our mortality, our groundlessness, and our insatiability. But any such project is like a limit project, right? That's not the normal form of our response. And it comes under various forms of suspicion. One might suspect that it is a repetition of that bad old idea of philosophy under a new disguise. Or one might suspect that it's what you suggested it is, that it is a kind of selective reconciliation of different views, and so forth. So I've tried to do that because it's this idea the mind can understand everything. There's the problem, we'll struggle with it, we'll master it, thought we'll go forward to the next step. It's true. That's what I try to do in these writings. But it appears that that's not what humanity generally tries to do. And I was consulting you about your own experience here. So surely that's not the only way in which one could address the problem of this pluralism of programs for the conduct of life. And what I was asking you is, in consulting your own experience, is there some other way? So how are you trying to do it? That's what I was trying. That's what I was asking you. So and is it the case? Is it the case that it's all or nothing? That is, either you're like Aristotle or Hegel, or you're just thrown back into the ordinary confusion of humanity. So if we think that the subject matter of moral philosophy, the fundamental subject matter of these first-order projects, we have to have a way of answering that question. Because who is going to address those first-order projects, and in what idiom, or by what means? Is it going to be a half-dozen people who are somehow in the 21st century trying to carry forward, against all odds and all plausibility, this classical idea of thought? Or will we think that that's an anomalous form of dealing with the problem, and that there are other problems, other ways of responding?
So I'm curious about the idea that everything changes, and that even the abstract laws that we try to come up with themselves change. And if that means that we have to reject any kind of abstraction, then do we also have to reject any abstraction in deciding how to lead our lives, in the sense that should we just be looking at every experience as a de novo and something that is going to change, and that it's not really possible to come up with something that might transcend through one experience to another and actually even tell us how the life is to be led, because even that might change.
Well, I'm not sure I understand. So these alternative moral programs that we've examined establish a whole series of different contrasts. So let me give you just two examples. One example is the one I just referred to. It's rather abstract. It's the distinction between views that seek salvation in individual action, as in Romanticism, and views that emphasize that any project for the conduct of life is from the outset necessarily social, as you suggested. So we have to take a position. But there are other contrasts which are more primordial, more primitive, more tangible, that are revealed in these discussions. Let me give you an example. So, under one moral view, associated, for example, with the ancient eudaimonism, the classical pagan ethics, we should, in general, in the world, seek to stay out of trouble, qualified by our responsibility to other people and the imperatives of altruism. On a number of the other views that we examined, such as Christianity or Romanticism or the religion of humanity, we should do the opposite. We should look for trouble. This is a fundamental contrast. And because it's not a play on words, it's a different way of living. Should our objective be to establish some kind of serenity in the end, manifest in self-possession and being steeled against the misadventures of the world? Or should we think that that's a failure that will rob us of the supreme good of life? And we could go through the course and establish a whole list of contrasts like that. Very tangible contrasts that require a decision. Now, these decisions we must make, it seems, against the background of assumptions about what we're like, the character of the human condition, and even the nature of the world, reality. So I interpreted your comment now as being at least in part about that issue, that is about the relation between these very pressing, urgent, and tangible options and these very large-scale intellectual understandings. So at the highest level of abstraction, there are these three families of views that I pointed to, cosmological views, very early in the course. So there's one view that you might call the project of classical ontology, which in some sense continues in the main modern tradition of fundamental natural science, as in classical mechanics, continued in 20th century physics. So that's the view that there's change in the world, so time is real, but not too real, because there is a permanent stock of ultimate constituents of the world and a permanent set of regularities, laws, symmetries, and constants. And the supreme object of thought is to reveal what is eternal. The less time-bound something is, according to this view, the more real it is. So the things that are most real in the world are these permanent constituents and these permanent regularities. Then there's a second set of views which says, no, everything is always turning into everything else. And everything is transient. Everything is an ephemeral manifestation of what is an underlying unified reality, which is itself timeless. So the distinctions among things are, if not unreal, less real than this timeless unified reality. Those are actually the two main sets of metaphysical or cosmological views in the worldwide history of thought. Now, in principle, there is at least one other position, which you might think is the most plausible, but is actually, in the history of thought, the position that speaks with the weakest voice. And this position says, everything that is real is ephemeral, including the regularities of nature and the constituents of nature, and everything changes sooner or later, including change itself. Change changes. But it is not less real by virtue of being mutable. So we then, on this third view, dissociate reality, the criterion of reality, from the criterion of immutability. And we reject the idea, common to the other two positions, that reality is proportionate to eternity. Now, so that's an example, and it's an interesting example because it is the most abstract and general example that one could imagine. It appears to be very distant from these pressing moral options. Nevertheless, it seems that these options we must take against the background of certain assumptions about reality, including those most abstract assumptions. So then our situation becomes complicated in the following way. We have to make a choice among these options, like whether we should stay out of trouble or look for trouble. And the arguments that we make in favor of one or another of these assumptions are always inconclusive or inadequate. But now there's the further complication that we have to conduct this argument or this choice against the background of these ideas about reality, our reality, the nature of humanity or of the self, the character of society and of history, but ultimately even the nature of the universe. And our insight into that is also a controversial and limited. So this is just an account of the situation. And if we want to present the predicament we find ourselves in realistically, then it seems that we have to take all this into account. So this is very different from the attitude of these classical philosophers like Aristotle and Hegel. So their attitude was, yes, the world has a structure. Reality, of the self, of society, and of humanity. And now I'm going to tell you what it is. Just read my book. I don't believe there'd be a single person here in this room who would accept that attitude as more than a joke. And yet we can't refuse to engage with these complications. So I'm not providing a solution. I have a position, and I do believe in the attempt to reinvent this ambitious idea of thought, of philosophy, trying to avoid its illusions. But any attempt to progress in that direction has to be sober. So we have to be sobered by the confrontation with these complications that I'm now evoking. And now I'm going to say something else, which is also controversial, that at first it might seem that all of this would lead us into some form of intellectual despair or nihilism. But I actually think it's the opposite, that the experience of engaging with these complications gives us hope. Because it's not just one big complication. It's a series of loosely related complications. And as we advance in our engagement with some, the others begin to take on another aspect. And so we don't have this smooth sailing, but we're not completely sinking either. So that's how I'm seeing it.
What do you mean by take on another aspect?
Well, because each of these complications has a connection to ideas about something else. So take this issue, take the example I gave of these two moral attitudes, looking for trouble and staying out of trouble. Well, our ideas about the self and about society bear on that choice. Not in some simple mechanical way of requiring us to have a conclusion, but they have a significance for that choice. So if we think that the character of human desire is protean, that our fundamental experiences of affirmation of being are associated with our connection to other people and with our engagement in society, that we have to connect with others without being subjugated, that we have to find a way of engaging in a particular world without surrendering to that world, so that we don't have to choose between isolation and surrender. Then we reject a series of bad ideas in those debates. For example, what I call the Hegelian heresy, that there's a definitive social template for human life, or the Sartrean or Romantic heresy, that all we can do with these structures is temporarily rebel against them, but we can't change their character. We begin to reject those illusions informed by a view of society, history, and the self. Then through that work, we start to elaborate ideas that begin to give more sense and texture to the aim of looking for trouble. Because looking for trouble then becomes an enactment of the truth that there is no definite dogmatic social template for our connection to other people. And it's only through struggle with society and with ourselves that we become bigger and reaffirm the sentiment of being. So in other words, without going into all of the details that we've had in other courses, what I'm trying to say is that these moral contrasts are not just a contest of blind faiths in the dark, that our ideas about the self, about society, and ultimately about the world have a bearing on these choices. It's not that they entitle us to arrive at conclusive results, but they throw light on those choices, and they make them be or seem to us more than just the assertion of a blind faith. So that's what I meant by the struggle with these ideas giving us hope.
So you were saying that considering these ideas help us affirm like some reasonable ideas about this other position.
So what I'm saying is this: one way in which we might experience the problem of the conduct of life is by thinking that at the end of the day, we have to make these choices among programs like those 5 programs that were on the board, or like these simple contradictions between looking for trouble and staying out of trouble. And that this is like a blind wager, a bet in the dark, in which we are staking our lives, our supreme good, on something about which we can have no insight. All we have is this dark intuition. I'm suggesting that that's not an adequate account of our situation, and that we can discover something about ourselves and about society and about history, about the transformability of the self and of society. We can progress in our understanding of the world itself. And it's not as if at the end of the day, we'd be back in the position of Aristotle and Hegel and have a system which would show us, therefore, we know what the right answer to these 15 moral questions is. It won't be like that. But it also won't be just a bet in the dark. And we will be able to think about these alternatives, to develop our insight, our moral imagination. And as a result, we may hope to be more open to the lessons of experience. So we'll have these partial insights, this inconclusive view, but there'll be enough of light for us to be able to learn from what happens to us, which wouldn't be the case if it were just a blind wager without ideas. So it's a claim that I'm making about actual experience. And you can all testify to whether this is a right claim or a wrong claim. That is, in engaging with these ideas in detail, are you, in the end, driven to nihilism? Or do you feel that there's more empowerment in our ability to struggle with these alternatives and to have a position, which is not just a blind bet? Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
the programs we started, it reminds me strongly of a famous scene from Confucius as his statement of his life stages. At age 15, he started to set his mind to learn, and then at age 30, he settled down in the society, probably with a career and marriage. And at 40, he did something. At 50, he achieved something, and 60, 70, so on. And so I know it seems absurd to divide those 5 themes into different life stages, but I believe those age numbers that Confucius said are also not the exact age numbers that he was in. And so to me, those materials has the 5 programs or 5 revisions has a certain order, maybe not necessarily in a diachronic order, but I feel that there's a logic order in it. I don't know if what is it, or should we follow it in different stages, or a certain logic order, or what is it?
No, please, please.
No, I don't believe in that particular order. So it's, to me, it seems like a Chinese counterpart to this, to the ancient eudaimonism. We live, we go through these stages. At the end, we achieve this self-mastery and clarity and self-possession, and we're integrated with ourselves. And even the antinomy between the contradiction between the moral order and the will has been superseded because we spontaneously will what is right. So that's a view of progression in human life. I don't share that view because I have accepted this revolutionary message of Christianity, of Romanticism, which has penetrated all these views that I put on the board, these post-Christian romantic or post-romantic views. But that's an example of the alternatives before us. So that particular conception of evolution, of the evolution of human life, is one of the, is a position in this world of contrasts that we've discovered. Will I at the end be serene? I hope not. I'll be in some kind of desperation. And so that's another view of existence. Someone who hasn't, yes.
So what you said about experience reminds me of Montaigne and his essay on experience, which begins with his saying, well, there are some things that logic and reasoning can't teach us, so then we have to rely on experience. And so he begins talking about these kidney stones and what time he wakes up in the morning to resolve such problems. But I think there are certain, logistical questions about how to live one's life that can be rooted in these, in this very abstract decision. So it's, what is the nature of the universe? Is it mutable? Is there something that's immutable? Are things in the universe immutable that we can rely on when there are other things? Questions like this don't pertain to questions like, what time should I get up in the morning? But questions like, how should I relate to the rest of the world? Should I be trying to get into trouble and get into certain kinds of trouble, or should I be trying to, should I try to avoid trouble
But if I could just interrupt you for a moment. So one theme there, before you go further, is the theme of the lessons of experience. So we have discussed here ideas rather than experiences. And one attitude could be, well, let's just learn from experience. But my claim, implicit in my remarks just a moment ago, is that experience is dumb. Experience doesn't speak of itself. Experience is rich to the extent that we can approach it with ideas, and then it speaks. So the notion that we can use brute experience to circumvent these intellectual struggles seems to be an illusion. And the sense of the hope that I was evoking a moment ago, one of the senses of that hope, is that as we increase in intellectual clarity, we can hope to get more out of experience. Experience will speak to us because we'll be able to consult it with some set of ideas. And they shouldn't be ideas that are designed to placate us. They shouldn't be a lullaby, as much of philosophy and religion have been. They shouldn't be a denial or a suppression of these contradictions in the human situation. In that sense, they should be realistic. But if we are able to develop those kinds of ideas, experience will appear to us in a different light. And our chances of learning from experience will then increase. And that's a huge source of hope, because it doesn't safeguard us against suffering and failure, but it presents life to us more completely. And the thing itself, the real thing, life, not a set of dogmas that are designed to deny experience. So I don't think that's different from what you were suggesting, right? Does that go in the same direction?
Yes, that's similar. I think part of the problem is that people like dogmas. You know, the idea, for example, of imposing on myself, I'll wake up at a certain time this morning and I'll perform these tasks in this, order and so on. People like being told what to do because there's a wealth of options, out in the world, and so we gravitate towards the thing which placates us, and that shouldn't be what we want. In fact, it probably should not be what we want. But but still, it's hard to resist the urge to kind of submerge yourself in the routines which make you feel happiest, or which decrease negative feelings, or I don't know, turn down the temperature of life, right? Because if your life is constantly running and moving, and you're forever reminded of all the things that you need to be changing and addressing and thinking about, that's invigorating to many people. And and there are a few people who are capable of sustaining that for a long period of time, or are able to work that kind of constant high energy insight into their day-to-day lives, but it's very difficult for most. And even for those people who are enriched by that kind of experience, it can be not just easier, but also help them function more as society demands them to. They slip into, a somewhat cooler.
Of course. So with respect to all of these projects that we've discussed, there's an issue of moral wisdom, that we not present to ourselves tasks that would overwhelm us. And once again, ideas about the self bear on that. So we won't wage a ceaseless romantic war against routine and repetition. We'll think that our ability to innovate, to transform ourselves, to transform society, requires the acceptance of some element of repetition in experience. So as in music, dissonance is possible against the background of consonance. But there's a whole view of the self implicit in that. And it will have practical implications. So for example, we might think that it's important to be prudent in small things so that we can be reckless in big ones. And then we'll begin to develop a series of moral ideas that will guide us. And that's another example of hope. Because and to me, taking the position I have in these arguments, that's something better than serenity. Because then we have this experience of escaping the sleepwalking of conformity, of being fully alive, but in a fashion or at a level that doesn't overwhelm us. So that's an example of it's just an aspect or an incident in a broader picture of the conduct of life. You might call it post-romantic. And it's a description of where we are.
I'm a teacher, and I'm reminded that way back in the day, there was a Greek philosopher named Socrates, and he was teaching his students. And the city in which he lived, this governing body or the sensibility of the society, objected to what he was teaching and asked him to stop. And he said no, and they said, well, if you don't stop, you're going to have to drink the hemlock. You'll have to be eliminated. So maybe this is what you're talking about in assessing the risks, but Socrates coolly took the hemlock. I'm asking you, what lesson do we have to learn from this? Do we just shut up and become repressed and drink ourselves to death, or do we rise to the occasion and martyr ourselves, or what is your opinion of this particular moment in philosophical history?
Well, I don't know that I'd accept, I don't know what Michael thinks about this, but I don't know that I would accept your image of Plato's Socrates as the model of true suffering. So Socrates drank the hemlock, but he died serene and dignified. There are these dangers of confronting authority, of confronting the world, but those aren't the dangers that have been here at the center of our discussions. The dangers that we've discussed are more fundamental. It's easy, in a sense, to confront despotism, to confront evil with moral certitude. But the problem is confronting ourselves in the midst of confusion about how to live and what to do, and no longer believing in this idea of a serene and integrated personality as the reward of our efforts. So then it's another conception, it's another idea that our aim on this other view is not to become serene, but to come to life. So while we have life, to really have it, and to become more human by becoming more godlike, and as the formula goes, to die only once. That's another idea, and different from the stages of life that we heard about in Confucius. And it is shadowed then by anguish all the way to the end. So it's, I guess go back to another theme here in our discussion. And of course, you remember the larger context. Context is the historical context, as opposed to the context of each of us in our individual existence. The context is we are living in a counter-revolutionary interlude, in a long revolutionary period in the history of humanity. This revolutionary project always had two faces. One face was the political face, democracy, liberalism, socialism, the overcoming of class society. The other face is the personalist face, becoming bigger, becoming more godlike, which is carried in the world mainly by the worldwide popular romantic culture, with its message, its revolutionary message of the divinity of the ordinary human being. So my view of our historical situation is that this project remains, in some sense, the strongest project in the world, with its two faces, the political and the personal. Because it's not the only project, it has enemies, but it commands the agenda. And the other projects that exist in the world are reactions to it or responses to it. So in that sense, it remains the strongest project. But in another sense, it's now weak. It's weak because its adepts no longer know what its next step should be. What should the next steps of the political version of this project be? That's a subject that is passionate. It should be of passionate interest to us. It's not the object of discussion here in this particular course. The alternatives. What are the institutional alternatives? And the other side is then, beyond the illusions of Romanticism, what are the next steps of the moral project? So my own motivation to engage in these arguments was this conviction that for this revolution to continue, for us to overcome this counter-revolutionary interlude, we have to reimagine the project on both its political side and its personal or moral side. We can only make it live by changing it. We can't make it live by pursuing it in its fossilized form. And then we have to engage these great options in the history of thought to equip ourselves with the instruments to do that. And that's another source of hope, because it's always the same thing. Hope is not the cause of action. Hope is the consequence of action. So if you start to act with respect to this political or moral predicament in the midst of all of these contradictions, you acquire hope by acting, because then you discover the contradictions, the transformative opportunities in thought and experience. And then you keep going all the way to the end with desperation, but paradoxically also with hope at the same time. So that's what I think. But as always happens in the world, time has run out. And time has run out for me, so I actually have to leave at this moment and leave you in the hands of Michael Pewitt, to whom I am immensely grateful for his boundless patience with my post-romantic struggles. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you. So Roberto did indeed, as you know, have to leave early, but, sorry. So Roberto did have to leave early, but let us continue the discussion. Please, yes.
I was wondering, I guess I wanted to ask Dr. Unger, but I guess maybe you could answer as well, is how does he define trouble? And is trouble something that is coming from society, or is there a natural trouble that is there? Like if we go out in the wild, is this source of trouble as well? And what happens if we remove the axiom of trouble to his mind?
Great question. Let's throw it out. Would anyone like to answer?
What is the question?
Oh, for Professor Unger, why is struggle so important? And what would be the trouble that we're constantly trying to struggle against?
How do we define the trouble?
Yeah, how would you define the trouble? Yes. Please.
Maybe, I don't have an answer to that, it's too hard, but maybe you can comment on my remark about Socrates and in a more Eastern philosophical milieu, that he was willing to give up his life to maintain the integrity of his ideas against a social group that didn't want to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
There must be similar cases in Eastern history, Chinese or...
Absolutely.
Give me something. Just I wasn't satisfied with Professor Unger's response. It's easy for all of us to say, oh, yes, Socrates was great. He went serenely, but in viewing that, I'm not very happy with, if you look at something and you say, that's going to be you if you pursue it, it's not so easy to suddenly say, oh, okay, I'm going to go serenely. I don't think most of us would be so comfortable knowing the outcome.
Yes.
So what is the Eastern view? I'll assume he took a Western point of view. What would be, something you might comment, knowing your study from Eastern philosophy?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's not a single one, but certainly just in terms of the ones that we've looked at in this course, a lot of the opening philosophical concerns begin from a different place, and therefore will ultimately end in a different place. Let me begin with the former and then ultimately get back to your question. So yes, as you know, Professor Unger's argument is kind of a radicalization of what we're calling the first orientation. So he very much sees his project as a continuation of that first orientation, a radicalization of the claims of the divinity of the individual as against the world, and a radicalization of the claim of radical love in terms of the political transformations that would therefore occur. And he very much sees his work as sort of reinvigorating that tradition. Indeed, we're looking at different orientations, too, that did not have as their starting point the claim of the divinity of the individual or the radical love that comes from that divinity. Just in terms of the ones we were looking at, so the Confucian material, of course, begins from a radically different position. It would say that you do not want to think of the individual as a single thing. Begin with a relational view of the self. And from this point of view, the danger of us as human beings is that we will become passive in the world, because insofar as we're relational beings, the danger is that we will simply, from a very young age, fall into certain types of responses to those around us. Those will become kind of patterns of responses. Those patterns can so define us as human beings that we will mistakenly call them my true self, but it's got nothing to do with my true self. It's simply a bunch of patterns I've fallen into. And so from that point of view, the view that I will assert my true self as against the world is actually, ironically, a dangerous position, because it would lead you to say, I'm going to stick by my patterns and never change them, which is, of course, the worst thing to do ethically from this point of view. The argument is, and I'll quote back to Confucius, the goal is to overcome the self being understood as this set of relations that simply are going to repeat endlessly. So from that perspective, your goal is to constantly work to overcome these sets of patterns that you have fallen into. And it leads to a very different philosophical project. That's not to say one is right and one is wrong. The goal of the class is in part to say, let's try to take these different positions, put them in their most philosophically compelling form, to hopefully allow each of them to challenge our fundamental assumptions. So we will avoid coming out with too easy a view that, oh, well, of course we should be individuals struggling against society. Well, immediately see there's a danger there and use that to challenge other views as well. Immediately, tons of questions. Yes, please.
According to Confucius, if we are supposed to break free from these patterns
Yes.
Through rituals, and the rituals can be character building, right? They
Yes.
can build like a human soul.
Yes.
But how does that not in itself become habitual?
Yes.
Because I think of Aristotle and how he said,
Right.
like, actions habitualize virtues and become your character.
Precisely. Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it really cuts to the heart of it, because one of the things that's intriguing about Confucianism is they use a very counterintuitive definition of ritual. And so when we think of ritual, we often think of ritual as kind of habits, right? They're habits that socialize us into ways of being in the world. And of course, from a Confucian perspective, they want rituals to do the precise opposite. The concern is that we're habitual creatures, and the goal of rituals is they break us out of these habits, which means, getting back to the heart of your question, they only work if they do a break, right? They only work if they break you from certain habits and cannot become another habit. So one of the examples we mentioned is the use of role reversals, for example, in rituals. And the reason this is crucial is the ritual act itself forces you to view the world from a different perspective, to take on a different role than you're usually taking on in life. And again, to get back to the heart of your question, it can't be something that would socialize you into another habit. I mean, there's no way, we're discussing the role reversal of a father and a son. There's no way you would be habituated through the ritual of, if you're the father, thinking that you're the son of your own son, or vice versa. And so it only works if it forms that break. Then the implication, of course, would be the point you're getting at. If that's the case, where does it take you? And the argument, that comes back to the quote from Confucius too, the argument would be you're trying to gain a sensibility that would involve a sensing of the world around you and all of its complexity that would not be based upon simply habitual responses to the world. And so the goal of rituals is to break your habits, not to give you new habits, but to constantly break them so that you're slowly gaining an ability to see the world outside of the habitual habits. Habitual habits, absurd way of putting it, but I think that is the key. That's the concern of this. So yeah, please.
So with role reversals,
Yes.
since that specific ritual,
Yes.
having done it once, does that kind of bar you from, if that becomes in itself, like, it loses the novelty if you do it again? Does the ritual have to be ever changing in order for you to constantly break free from potential of falling into a new pattern?
The answer is yes. And so the way they will put it is, at the beginning, you're doing rituals you're born into, right? We're born into a world, and you begin working with those. But you're only working well if you're making these breaks that then allow you to alter the rituals around you. And if you're not doing that, then yes, the danger is they would simply become another set of habits. Now, another key point they will make is, because luckily, this would strike us as a bad thing, but from this point of view, of course, it's a really good thing, the rituals will never form a coherent system. The goal is, if you're really using these rituals to break perspectives and break habits, the fact is, if you're doing tons of these rituals, they're all mutually self-contradictory, right? So in one, you're the father to a son, and another, you're something radically different. And so the good news is, if you're using them as training exercises, it's actually very difficult to be perfectly habituated into a new set of patterns, because the different rituals will actually be taking you in different directions. which from this point of view is a good thing because they're constantly breaking you from any one set of habits that you would fall into. Absolutely. Tons of questions, please. Yes. Yeah.
Very similar to post-romanticism to me, where, so Professor Unger talked about the plurality of the self. He doesn't want to be a unified, static person. And a lot of description of post-romanticism seems to me to be talking about forming habits which allow them to be flexible.
Yes.
A flexible framework for one's life. And that's sounding a lot like Confucianism, creating, something that's sustainable,
Yes.
but very flexible. So you can
Yes.
take many different perspectives on the same thing, but you don't tire yourself out from doing this. So I'm a little confused because
Yes.
on the one hand, at the start they seem very, very different, but now they seem to be coming closer and closer together.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I do think they are quite different. But let me actually scoot back and say a little bit about what has been sort of an underlying disagreement with Professor Unger and I, and he'll be watching this, so I hope over email he can respond in turn. So one of the underlying disagreements that he and I have is, and I'll begin with his position. So insofar as he views his own argument as a radicalization of this first orientation, which he very much views as a radicalization of Christianity. So the argument is it's Christianity that brings in this notion of a divinity within each human, and he believes that that is what led to the world revolutions, both political and personal, of the 19th and 20th centuries, that he sees himself as very much trying to reactivate, with the sense that they've become less powerful, and he wants to reactivate them. I think the power of his work lies there. The place where he and I disagree is I think it leads him to have a tendency to say everything else does not involve anything that tries to change the self or the world. And in a nutshell, the view is the second orientation is really trying to train you to be serene in the world. And the third orientation, involving things like Confucianism, is simply training you to accept the world as it currently exists. I think both of those are empirically wrong. I think Buddhism is not about serenity. I think when you read these Buddhist texts, that's not what it's teaching us to do. It's pretty radical, the claims it's making. And the claims would certainly involve a very strong and radical transformation of the world. In fact, a rejection of the entire world we're living in, and which would literally be seen as a creation of the will that you're breaking. And certainly the heart of Confucianism is the entire ethics of it, in fact, I would put in a strong form, is to break out of these habits. And they will say very explicitly, once you're doing this, the goal is to then start creating worlds where people can flourish. And there's no, by definition, prescribed view as to what that will mean, because it will always mean different things in both mundane situations as well as at a larger societal level. So one of my disagreements with Roberto is I think he wants to say it's really this first orientation alone in world history that pushes toward radical self-transformation and radical transformation of the world around us. I would say most of the great philosophical and religious traditions of the world are very much all about that. That's one of the key themes that unite them all. Then, to get back to the heart of your question, are there nonetheless real differences amongst them? Absolutely. So I do think it makes a world of difference in terms of what physically one is doing if you begin with the notion of the unique self that is breaking from conventions, or if you're beginning with this notion of a relational self that you're then trying to construct from that. But I would say both are very much about changing the world around one, changing oneself and changing the world around one. And to go back to an earlier point, Professor Unger also said, we referred to these axial age religions that emerge midway through the first millennium BCE. So these emerge when there is a breakdown of an earlier Bronze Age aristocratic society that had really dominated Eurasia for about 2 millennia. And these were societies in which literally all positions of power were defined by birth. And so if you're born an aristocrat, there you lay. If you were born a peasant, there you remained. And everything was defined by birth. And for a number of historical reasons, these civilizations begin breaking down in the first millennium BCE, leading to the emergence of tremendous forms of political experimentation. New religious and philosophical movements begin. Literally all of the major world religions come out of this period. The major philosophical positions we've been discussing come out of this period. And I would say all of them are committed to saying humans and the world around us need to be changed. That's the common theme of all of them. But they have very different views as to what humans are, what it would mean to change, what the world is, and what that would mean to change. So I think they're all about change, but they have very, very different views as to what that would mean. Yes, please.
Right, so what you just said, I was thinking in terms of the discourse around human rights, for instance.
Yes, yes.
How the foundations often seem to be maybe in the first order traditions.
Yes.
Like, autonomy of the self.
Yes.
Will, and I guess, would you say that it's maybe a popular misconception that the second order cannot account for something along the lines of human rights?
Very much. I think this is a perfect example that when people discuss human rights, the view which is very commonly stated in the West is that can only come from this first orientation. That can only come from a radicalization of Christian notions of the divinity of the individual. And anything else, by definition, is all about teaching people to stay in their position. Again, I just think historically that's not true. And do you have visions of attempts to radically change the world along very much the lines of what human rights discourse is trying to do throughout world history, certainly post-axial age? Has that occurred? Absolutely. And in fact, and I'll give my opinion strongly here, would human rights discourse be dramatically improved if we could think of it in a more cosmopolitan way, as opposed to exclusively talked about in terms of some version of the divinity of the individual? I personally think it would be. And you would have a vision of human rights, therefore, that actually be building upon the tremendous work, by which we mean 2 millennia now, throughout the world of attempts to do this. So yes, I think human rights discourse, like philosophy in general, would be enhanced by a more cosmopolitan approach. So yes, I very much agree. Yes, please.
When you talk about breaking old patterns and
Yes.
using rituals to create new patterns, but still we are creating new patterns. So what is the point? Can I understand is break itself is significant or transformation, as we talk about. And so we have to constantly break the old patterns, and even we establish a new one, then we have to break it again. Is it the break itself is important, or the new direction, or where should we go after or what is the purpose of breaking?
Yes.
And is it all kinds of possibilities, or as Confucian conception as goodness, and how
Yes.
to define goodness and towards standards, and
Yes.
also drawing Professor Unger's division of political agenda and moral agenda of the same thing, and
Yes.
also maybe social agenda too.
Yes.
So what should we understand of those breaking? And also back to the post-romanticism. I understand that there's post-romanticism, but if you break from a romantic love, most people fall into another romantic love. So what does it mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, wonderful set of questions. And it actually touches directly on your earlier question, too, which I sort of thrown back, but now I will arrogate my position to give a provisional answer to as well. So yes, I would say, and it goes back to your earlier question, too, about the differences amongst these. So one, at least potential danger, although it can also be put in a positive way, of the first orientation is it does create a sense of ethics as constant struggle, constant break. So it's a constant work of seeing the world around you as holding you back, and it's a constant work of breaking. We saw this very clearly in Emerson. Nietzsche, if you've read Nietzsche, very much holds this position. And so it's one of endless struggle and endless breaking. Now, I think you're exactly right. A big difference here is in Confucianism, where yes, you have a concern with breaking these habits and breaking the patterns, but the vision really isn't one of endless struggle in that sense. There is a vision of where you're going, for better or for worse, but again, let's lay it out to allow the debate to occur. And you mentioned the term, and it's a key one, variously translated. Goodness, benevolence, humaneness. The Chinese term is just ren, which it's a very open-ended term, and any of the ones I just mentioned, goodness, benevolence, humaneness, are perfectly fine as translations, in part because they're as almost as seemingly open-ended as the Chinese term itself. But getting back to the heart of what I think is really going on here, I'll lay out what I think basically is the argument. So Confucius's argument is, at first, we are these habit-forming creatures. We fall into these habits that we take so completely for granted. They think they're just part of us and the world around us. You're doing rituals to break you out of these patterns. But I think the view is not, and then it's just endless breakage, and that's the rest of your life, constantly doing more breakage. In fact, the goal, and it goes back to question 2, your goal is to actually move beyond even needing rituals. So if you're really doing this, you move beyond even requiring the rituals to do the breakage. And what you're trying to achieve is the sense of Ren. Now, it's important to note, we'll never achieve it, right? The idea is this is an endless process, so it's not like at age 10, you're going to get this, and then, kabam, you're humane. So it's endless work, but not endless breakage necessarily in that sense, because what you're hopefully doing from the breakage, which at the early level, that's the word's term, it's used things like just overcome, break. It's early on, it's simply put in a negative way. But what you're hoping to gain is an ability to really see the world, oneself, those around us, the world in general, as inherently messy, complicated, and relational. In other words, seeing that we have constructed worlds around us. Usually, since we do it passively, the idea is most of the worlds we've constructed are negative. They hold people back. Your goal is to really begin to sense the world in its complexity, sense the fact that, and this would be viewed from a relational view of the self as a fact, that things we're doing are affecting others all the time, constantly. If we're doing it by rote, we're affecting others by rote, and that's the nature of our relationships. But if you're really sensing the world in its complexity, what you're training yourself to do is sense, if I do certain things, it will bring out certain responses, often counterintuitive because other people are patterned too. And you're training yourself to see that they aren't just their patterns any more than we just are our patterns. We're more messy than that in a dangerous or good way. And so what you're training yourself to do is to sense that and begin acting in ways that begin breaking these patterns. And the breakage, therefore, getting back to the heart of the question, is aimed at a very specific goal. You're trying to create a world where you're really sensing people, not by rote, not by pattern, not by habit, but you're really sensing them, and most importantly, sensing what you can do at a mundane level, but then ultimately at a larger societal level, what you can do to create worlds within which humans can really flourish. That's the goal. And let me just give you a very concrete example, absurdly mundane, but it's very telling. A lot of stories of Confucius will be along the following lines. So Confucius walks into a room, and he's so good, because he spent decades doing this, that he walks into a room, senses the patterns of people around him, and will do little things. Tones of voice, he'll quote a poem, he'll tell a story, but he'll just do little things that will create a sudden sort of shift in the patterns around him and shift the trajectory of the situation. And people will describe him, when he does this, as this kind of joyous figure that like you're around him, you feel this kind of charismatic joy because he suddenly, by the way he acts, he sort of brings people together. And by bringing people together, it suddenly opens up real possibilities because they begin really actually relating to each other, not by pattern, not by habit, but really relating to each other. And then the sense is, by being able to do this at a mundane level, he's doing this for the larger world too. Like he's equally able to see the dangerous patterns playing out in society, the trajectories those are setting in, and things one can do to break these patterns and open up different possibilities. So here, you're exactly right. It's not a sense of endless struggle, endless breakage. It's, if you're getting better at this, You're no longer breaking, struggle, the terminology will shift. It's you're sensing and you're creating these worlds within which people can relate. And then, goes back to your earlier question too, what concretely, for example, would you do institutionally, totally open-ended? And the view is, you can't say in advance. You can only train yourself to be able to sense this, and then once people become better and better at doing it, then they will be able to sense institutionally what sorts of work needs to be done, which by definition will be radically different in different times and different places. But I think you're right. It's not endless breakage. There is a vision as to where this takes one, but an open-ended vision. It's one of just radical interrelationships. Yes, please.
I find it interesting why we need society, because if you think about it, it seems quite paradoxical that you've got most of these philosophies and religions that say to transcend society, to remove yourself from society, to go into a haven that's just you, to self-reflect, to, be it through Buddhism, Christianity, many different philosophies say this. And yet, so why is it then that society builds us? Is it because it gives us an increase in the amount of transactions we can have and things we may learn from interacting with them that we would not otherwise realize on our own? And why is it, if we're so much stronger as an individual, that isn't better? We shouldn't live our lives isolated and alone. What is it that society provides us with that we so desperately crave and need, and are then supposed to transcend when we already can reach that individually?
Yes, it's a great question, and it does cut to the heart of a lot of the differences among these different philosophical movements. And certainly one extreme version of the self breaking out of the world around one could easily take one to that position. So if you sort of imagine an Emerson, and then read certain sections of Emerson read exponentially, it could take you to that position. That basically, Emerson himself doesn't go there, but you could imagine that being taken to a radical position where the individual is really everything, and society is nothing but something that would hold us back. And we should ideally be breaking from all things in society that hold us back, and ideally even if we could be removed from it altogether. If somehow that were possible, you could imagine philosophically that position being taken to such an extreme that the argument would be, yeah, if that were physically possible, that would be a good thing. Going back to the heart of these differences, in Confucianism, that would be unacceptable, right? So in Confucianism, we are inherently relational creatures. And so even if you plucked one of us and tossed us onto a desert island, we would certainly want to do things from this point of view. We would want to train ourselves to be able to really to see the environment around us and not act by habit and rote. So we would certainly still try to do things. But I think the view would also be, you can't do much. Because the important thing as to how we grow as humans, and even the way we'd be judged as to the degree to which we're doing it, is by the ways we interact with those around us. Like, we're relational creatures. The sense is we usually relate poorly to each other, but we're potentially capable of relating extraordinarily well with each other and building worlds where we can truly relate, and that's how we're being judged. So from a Confucian perspective, being an individual removed from society would not only not be a good thing, it's not even clear if you'd even have a criterion of saying if someone is really becoming a better human being, because the criterion really from Confucianism is how you relate to those around you, and ultimately, how can you build worlds where people can really flourish? So from this point of view, society isn't a problem. The problem is that society is usually not, we are part of why society is not doing well, but the problem isn't society per se. The goal is to create a better world, a better society. It's a great question because it cuts to the heart of a lot of the philosophical.
Easily say, why do we need to be judged? Maybe what's judging us is society itself. Maybe that's holding us back as individuals.
Yeah, and that would certainly be, again, an extreme version of the first orientation, that I should be who I am, and this is just me, and I should love myself and embrace myself for who I am, and if others don't like what I'm doing, that's their problem, but I won't be affected by them because I'm just myself. And And less extreme versions, of course, those are all terms that are very common in America now, where, of course, people live in society, but we often will use this terminology to talk about ourselves. I'm just me. I love myself for who I am, and I don't care what others say because I'm just me. So that's that first orientation move. From a Confucian point of view, that's very dangerous. Like, you shouldn't be loving yourself and embracing yourself for who you are. You should be overcoming yourself. and the degree to which you're doing so in an effective way comes down to, are you building a better world around you? In other words, with those around you, both an immediate level and a larger level. And so from that point of view, your goal isn't to break from the world. Your goal is to create a better world. It's a crucial question. It does cut to the heart of a lot of these philosophical positions. I mean, the differences between them. Yeah. Yes, please.
I was wondering which you thought would be more faithful to the purposes of this course.
Yeah.
A unified but cynical explanation of kind of a common thread of failure across all these concepts, or a disjointed but optimistic one that tries to find the strongest, realist point within each and make it even a little realer, make it something that like a member of our electorate or service sector would actually understand.
Yeah.
Like the Confucius example, I could analogize to yoga and understanding of the body, and once you get some flexibility, you don't need to do the stretches anymore. You kind of just learn that your body can move in certain ways. So like, would you prefer that sort of optimism, or would you prefer the traditional like philosophical, here's my replacement theory for all the other theories?
Yeah, great question. And in answering, I will show that I've actually been very moved by things like the Confucian tradition. So I would agree with the Confucian tradition in the following point of view, that one of our inherent dangers as human beings is this tendency to simply accept the world, ourselves and the world around us, as natural, not realizing that it's largely a construct, and usually a bad construct, because we've done it passively. And from that point of view, the goal is to challenge ourselves constantly, to challenge our assumptions, to challenge our basic ways of being, to challenge things we take for granted, things we assume to be natural. So from that point of view, the goal of a philosophical enterprise needs to be that challenging. And any attempt to create an easy synthesis that would kind of wipe that away, because that's the danger of a synthesis. As you said, it sort of wipes away the differences. The danger of that is that then it allows us to become complacent again and sort of accept that, OK, I've come up with the final philosophical position, which is always, from this point of view, a dangerous thing to have. So my view would be to say we should always be very wary, to the point of, I think we should commit ourselves to not thinking we'll ever get it, to having a final philosophically correct view. I think we won't. From this point of view, which I think is onto something profound, it just is a messy and complicated world. And we will never have a perfect way to organize it, because even what would be, from a certain point of view, a good way to organize it right now, a century from now almost assuredly would not be. And so you will never have a perfect way to organize this messy world, and whatever would need to be done a century from now would obviously have a ton to do with what we do, or more importantly, sadly, fail to do now. And their projects will probably be involved, if they even exist, from cleaning up the horrors that we've created for them. So I would say the most powerful philosophical move for us to take is to systematically, to use a very odd word, prevent ourselves from having assumptions or systematic positions that we would hold to and think to be correct. And I would even go so far as to say the notion of a unique self is potentially one of those. That's a potentially dangerous view if held to be the sort of basis by which our philosophical work will occur. So the more we can do to not have a single foundation for our views, the better. Now, that's real work. I mean, that is extremely difficult to achieve that. But what it would mean philosophically in terms of how we live our lives, getting back to the heart of your question, is the endless work of trying to see where are we making assumptions, visions of the self, visions of society that we're falling into, trapping ourselves into. They're often difficult to find. I mean, certainly the ones Confucius was concerned about are quite different from the ones that, that we would need to be concerned about now. But you're constantly trying to do that, and you're constantly trying to say philosophically, how would one live one's life in a way that would help to both break those, but also with a sense of you're breaking for a larger purpose. Yes, please. Of course.
Would it be okay to hone in on maybe one or two, well, not one, at least two or three ideas in specific and kind of almost ignore some other ones that you don't think need more exposition? If you're going to do this disjointed, this is right about this is right about this is what I like about this, like, can you just pick like 3 or 4 and really hammer home like a well-articulated point, maybe agreeing with the Confucianism, with the yoga example or something like that?
The answer is yes. But what I would say is, at this stage, a more cosmopolitan approach, I suspect, is the best. And the reason I say that is I think we're living in a moment, we've lived in it for a while now, where really one set of ideas is completely dominating the world. Here I would completely agree with Professor Unger. I think Professor Unger would say that's a good thing because those ideas are correct. But I would say the flip side of that is it's also very dangerous. And those ideas, have they played a significant and even good from certain perspectives historical role? Of course, absolutely. But does any position, at least I would say, have potential dangers? I would say, again, of course, and do these particular notions of the divine human, for example, have they entailed certain dangers? I think I would at least say very clearly so. And so I would say at this stage, one of the most powerful things we can do from a philosophical perspective, but I mean this, again, in terms of just how we would live our basic life, philosophical in a very strong sense of the word, would be to become as cosmopolitan as possible and try to train ourselves. And it's a training exercise. We are not raised to think this way, and it's not part of our common culture to think this way, but to train ourselves to at least be open to the possibility that so-called foreign cultures and so-called different times, which is already a sort of dangerous way to thinking, which is why I call them so-called, but philosophical positions that have arisen throughout the world maybe are onto something. And when they strike us as very bizarre and counterintuitive, to give the obvious example, telling us to follow rituals of all things, that in some cases may be a good thing, because sometimes counterintuitive ideas will challenge us and help us to recognize the complacent ways we'll take certain assumptions for granted. In this case, if we take for granted the unique individual, by definition, rituals are just bad things. Well, maybe that's a dangerous assumption. And maybe taking seriously arguments that rituals really matter, even if we're not fully convinced by them, I, in some degree have been, but even if one isn't, at the minimum, it is a very helpful challenge to be so pushed against one's basic assumptions. So my strong recommendation to all of you, in terms of just all the things you'll be working on, think in a cosmopolitan way. I mean, going back to the human rights question, take for granted the real possibility that ideas that have arisen throughout world history may be onto something, and even if they seem to cut against our most fundamental assumptions, that may be a very, very helpful reason, a very strong reason why we should take them very seriously. Taking seriously, again, not meaning we have to agree with them, but taking them seriously in the sense of allowing for the possibility for them to really challenge our most fundamental assumptions. And I think if all of us committed to that, all of us human beings committed ourselves to that, I think we would create a much, much, much better, that's putting it too weak, incomparably better world, incomparably better. Whereas if we allow one set of assumptions to take over, for all the powers of certain sets of assumptions, there are always going to be dangers. And the more homogenized our world becomes in terms of assumptions we take for granted, I think the more we're going to be creating a very dangerous world. And there might not be humans a century from now to clean up the mess. Yeah. Yes, please.
I agree 100%. I think my frustration comes at the idea that in order to do that, we have to question things that go down to ontology. Like
yes.
it goes so deep. It's not just this sort of surface level. And going back to the question
yes.
of human rights,
absolutely.
To treat human rights as though they're a neutral sort of this like acclamation of human progress.
Precisely.
And suddenly we've reached this like neutral space where it's very much clericalized secularism.
Precisely.
That's based on a Judeo-Christian
absolutely.
framework. which becomes very frustrating for the rest of the world that does not ascribe to
Absolutely.
this framework.
Precisely.
And so when we say we need to become more cosmopolitan in our views, how do we do that in terms
Yes.
of, one, taking in the world, so in the consumption of knowledge, but then also in the, not so much maybe rejection, but recreation of the world.
Yes.
In using such different ontologies.
Precisely.
And so I don't know how you would approach this, but even in work, say around, one of the things that we struggle with a lot in this country today are issues around race, for example.
Yes,
And racial
absolutely.
construction. And
Absolutely.
even those who engaged with these things still remained within a particular construction that is based on,
Yes.
again, a specific ontology. So if we talk about
Yes.
someone like Du Bois, who's a very much a revolutionary figure, still he remained ontologically within a specific Western framework.
Yes, yes.
Whereas maybe someone like Fanon
Right. Yes.
removed himself from that, but that's so rare. And how is that? How do we recreate that in
Yes.
our, in our carrying forth philosophically in the world?
Yes, I agree completely, and I think this is one of the crucial challenges. And to underline it, let me begin with a negative example and then get to the heart of your question, of positively where we would go. But here's a negative example, just directly along the lines of what you were mentioning. So in the late 19th and 20th centuries in America, there was among some intellectuals the view that, indeed, we've become overly taken by a certain set of Judeo-Christian ideas. They've come to so dominate the discourse, we're not even recognizing the possibility that other ideas, other religions might be onto something. And so they began to self-consciously create these forums in which which representatives of the different religions would come together. Now, on the face of it, this sounds just great. But the way they did it is they began with an ontological assumption that we were all basically saying the same thing. The view as to what that was is all of us want to become more spiritual. All the different religions, for all the seemingly different content positions they hold, they're all just about trying to help us achieve a higher spiritual level. And so if we get everyone together and have them translate the terms that they use into a notion of spirituality, if we get rid of all of these other silly things that many will talk about, like rituals, for example, because that's, we won't agree with those, but we'll talk about spirituality. And so basically what you do de facto, in fact, literally what happened, is representatives who were willing to play that game and say, yes, my religion is all about spirituality, and I won't talk about rituals. I won't talk about the content of any of the positions we hold. I won't talk about ontology. I can be at the table. And then, of course, once we're at the table, surprise, surprise, everyone says, lo and behold, we all agree with each other. Well, that's because to get at the table, you had to pre-agree to the exact same ontology and give up everything else. And if anyone at the table said, for example, rituals matter, they would have been pushed aside because, no, that's traditional, that's bad, we're talking about modern spiritual religions. So they weren't allowing the ontology to be in any manner, shape, or form challenged. So, and I think the other examples you mentioned are along the same lines. So yes, I think what we really need to do if we talk about building a cosmopolitan world, that work of really recognizing that you have fundamentally different ontologies, that we cannot be complacent and simply say, okay, I'll be tolerant of different ontologies, because then we're not being challenged. No, you have to really take them seriously. And you have to take them seriously to allow them to challenge things we take for granted. And until we do, we are not building a cosmopolitan world. Until we do, we're doing the equivalent of saying, we understand human rights and those other foreign cultures don't, and either they'll accept our human rights or they'll be stuck in the traditional world, but either way, we'll respect them. Well, no, that's not respecting. That's taking for granted they have nothing to say, and they either accept our discourse or they don't, but we have nothing to learn from them. So I think the key work, and this is incredibly difficult work because we're pushing against almost every major drive in our culture at the moment to do this, is to say we need to really recognize that these different ontologies should fundamentally challenge our assumptions. And this takes us out of a world of saying, oh, we're all really the same, we should all be tolerant of each other. That's actually part of a very complacent world of saying, we're all the same because I redefine everyone as being the same, which means I'm not really being challenged at all. So yes, I think you're exactly right. Yes, please.
With the word defining a cosmopolitan world, you're going to have a person within the cosmopolitan world defining it. You have to have something that's not a human or not somebody who's a member of the cosmopolitan world to allow it to truly be a cosmopolitan world, or else my version of a cosmopolitan world is different from his, is different from yours. We're going to allow certain things to develop and say, oh, we're allowed to have this many different units of cosmopolitanism, but this one is riffraff. Like, how do you?
Yes, or what you do, instead of thinking we all are involved in these different cultures, which are all bounded, and we need to either be tolerant of them or accept certain representatives of them to talk to. On the contrary, say, no, 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 the world is really messy. There is no single bounded culture or set of single bounded cultures out there. It is a messy world filled with all sorts of complicated relations. Among those relations are these incredibly powerful ideas with entire practices based in them that have been developing, but none of them are monolithic, or rather the most monolithic one now is the one emanating from America, but most of these are very unmonolithic. And our goal, ethically as human beings, is to try to work as well as possible in such a relational world. So there would never be anything above that that would say, are we really listening to each other? No, we're training ourselves to be constantly challenged by the world around us and learning to relate to those around us. And it's a lifelong challenge because there's nothing outside of this relationality. And even to touch on a piece of your question, it's been one that Steve has been consistently and wonderfully bringing up throughout the course. I mean, even the word human is something we probably need to question. I mean, we're talking about human visions, but if we really see the world as relational, what we're defining as human is probably, in fact, I'll use an absurdly paradoxical way to emphasize the absurdity of our position. I mean, by definition, that is a purely anthropocentric perspective, by definition. And so many ontologies in the world would not accept the notion that humans are these radically distinctive things in the world. That, too, should be challenged. And if, again,